Almost 30 years ago, research in the Netherlands discovered an enzyme mutation linked to male violence. It's a provocative clue for anyone exploring the nature versus nurture question to try to explain that darkest side of masculine behavior. And it's one of the things that got journalist Daemon Fairless interested in the question of genetics, which he considers in his new book, Mad Blood Stirring: The Inner Lives of Violent Men. And he joins us now for more. Hi, Daemon.
Hi there.
What is MAOA, and what does it have to do with the likelihood that someone will be prone to violence?
So MAOA is monoamine oxidase A.
Say that 3 times
exactly.
fast.
It's an enzyme that we all produce. And one of the things it does is it breaks down a number of neurotransmitters, so the chemical component of how our brain cells interact. So it's a really complicated story. It's super interesting. What was happening is there was a family of Dutch men, or the men in this Dutch family, in the 1970s came to the attention of medical researchers because they were terrible. They were just wildly antisocial and violent. They were, doing things like setting houses on fire.
One tried to rape his sister.
One tried to rape his sister at knife point. Aggravated assault, trying to run a boss over with a car. And it was the kind of thing like they were known. And in the family, it was known that a lot of the guys in this family had this problem. So one of the female relatives, I think, sought out help at a hospital. And what ended up happening is when researchers looked at the behavior, this is profound, crazy, wild, antisocial behavior, it became clear that it followed a pattern of being an X-linked trait. So that means that there are certain disorders or genetic traits that are passed on the X chromosome. And it often presents itself in men because we only have one X chromosome. We have an X and a Y chromosome. Women have 2. And so if you've got a mutation on one, the other normal, so to speak, X chromosome will kind of compensate. So it became clear that it was probably an X-linked trait. And then later in the 90s, a guy named Hans Brunner discovered that there was a mutation of this gene that expresses this enzyme, monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA. And effectively, the men in this family, I think there were 14 of them, they were producing none of this enzyme. So what that meant is that the neurotransmitters in their head or in their body was building up to abnormally high levels. Now these neurotransmitters are associated with the regulation of mood and emotion. So it became a pretty good hypothesis that this gene mutation, which affected this enzyme, which affected the neurotransmitters, was a correlate of this behavior. And there were other things. There's like a lower IQ. There was impulsive behavior, extreme sexual behavior. So it was a cluster. The violence is a part of a cluster of behaviors. But it became this really interesting prospect that maybe there is some genetic link between this mutation and violence. Now, the research developed, and researchers in lab mice developed genetically engineered mice that had a similar deletion to their version of this gene. And when they weren't producing MAOA, or monoamine oxidase A, the mice became extremely violent. They'd kill their cage mates sometimes. So people started thinking, is this a genetic correlate of violence? But.
There's a but.
There's a big but.
Yeah.
This is 14 men. And I think since then there have been 2 other families that have been discovered that have this mutation. It does not explain even a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of male violence out there. However, and this gets more complicated, more interesting, but more complicated, all of us, have a gene to produce MAOA, the enzyme. And there are 3 variants of that. 2 of those variants, 2 of those genes, result in relatively high levels of monoamine oxidase A. One of them results in a relatively low level of the enzyme. But if you look at all of us, normal people who have these genes, there's no difference between the people who have this high MAOA gene and the relatively low level.
And I guess that's where nurture comes in then.
Well, that's where nurture comes in. That's where it gets really interesting, is that in, I think it was in 2002, there was an English study that came out looking at guys who had the low monoamine oxidase A gene and had also had a harsh childhood, who were mistreated as children. They had a much higher chance of later in life being arrested for being criminally violent. So what that suggested is that it's not just the gene, but there's a genetic environmental interaction that creates a later outcome that, it means that there's a higher likelihood of being violent if you have those two things working for you. And since then, if I can further complicate this, there have been a couple other genes, one with the serotonin system and one with the dopamine system, that works the same way. If you have a certain genetic variant and you've had a traumatic, abusive, nasty childhood, you're more inclined to violence. And it gets more complicated, if I may. The MAOA gene, the low MAOA gene, was dubbed by the popular press as a warrior gene, suggesting that certain men were genetically vulnerable to violence. I don't particularly like that term because it
makes it sound good.
It also makes it sound as if these men with this genetic predisposition, the men with this genetic profile are predisposed to being violent and aberrant and terrible. That's not the case. One of the things to keep in mind is that this MAOA gene is present in about 1/3 of all men. It's present in all ethnicities, all races. The other two genes that I mentioned are present. You probably have a 50% chance of having these. So this is a huge sector of the human population that has this. What happened is there was another study done by an American sociologist named Ronald Simons that was really an example of amazing scientific questioning, because you ask particular questions and you'll get particular answers. He wanted to know what happens when you give the people who have this warrior gene, so to speak, are exposed not just to nasty, terrible environments as kids, but really good ones. And the kids who have the warrior gene and had great, loving, compassionate, enriched childhoods were less likely to be just predisposed to violence than even so-called normal people, those without the so-called warrior gene. So it's not a gene that predisposes you towards violence. It's a gene that predisposes you to being sensitive to your environment. If you grow up in a terrible, violent environment, it makes sense to be violent. You have to protect yourself. You learn that this is a tool of survival in this terrible environment. Doesn't make it right. If you grow up in this other environment, you learn that it is not the right tool to use, that there are other more productive, less destructive ways of being. So the people that we think are genetically predestined to be more violent are exactly the people who are genetically predestined to be less violent given
the environment.
So it's important to understand the genetics of this, but the bigger picture is, if you understand the genetics, you realize how important the environment is. Right. So you get hyper-focused on the nature, you lose the importance of the nurture, and vice versa.
When we hear about mass murderers, we often hear their violence linked to mental health problems. Is it accurate to conflate extreme violence and psychopathy?
Is it inaccurate to conflate extreme violence and psychopathy? It's complicated. Most psychopaths are not violent. So a psychopath is a particular specific behavioral and emotional profile that's marked by, among other things, probably most importantly, the inability to feel compassion or remorse or empathy towards another human being. Human beings can be more like objects than other people with inner lives that you care about. They're also, manipulative, extremely good liars, superficially charming. They often have a track record of, if not crimes, but taking advantage of people. So the understanding we have of a psychopath has a lot to do with the popular representation of them as a mass killer, in TV shows or movies or whatever. But most psychopaths aren't violent. However, of the people who are in prison for horrendous violent acts, psychopaths are disproportionately represented, meaning that they do a lot of the really, really most egregious stuff. So if you've got someone who is a serial killer, a Clifford Olson or the guy I read about in the book, there's a pretty good chance they're going to be a psychopath. That's a pretty good bet. But you'll also find psychopaths out there who are, successful CEOs, leaders of the free world, for example, things like that. You'll find successful, non-violent, non-criminal psychopaths out there too.
Well, you write that psychopathy has been labeled as an example of balanced selection. What is meant by that description?
Yeah, so that's a term that's used by some of the researchers who study psychopathy. And I think what they mean by that is that we all live in a social contract. I'm nice to you, you're nice to me. I see your kid fall down, I'll pick that kid up and make sure they're okay. We have developed empathy as a very important social tool. It's a cohesive bonding behavior, and it makes me care about you inherently because I know you're a person, you feel the same way I do. And so we have a give and take in our relationship, right? I'm not going to rip you off because I feel that's wrong, and that sense of it being wrong is predicated on me caring about you, inherently not wanting to do another human being harm. And that works, for the most part, that kind of works to keep us as a cohesive social creature. But you can have a small proportion of people in a empathetic community that just take and don't give. It's a kind of parasitic relationship. You can't have that population of those people be too high because the whole unit would fall apart, right? If everyone was a psychopath, society wouldn't work very well. But you can have a small number of people with, basically a parasitic behavior leeching off of those of us who tend to do giving and taking. So the idea is that the psychopathic personality is a set of behaviors and an emotional stance, I guess, that serves that person pretty well at the expense of others.
Well, Daemon Fairless, it's been fascinating speaking to you, and thank you for helping us understand the inner lives of violent men.
Thanks for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.